if we talk about Huck Finn, right, whether or not this is a racist book, we should probably get to the bottom of that a little bit, right? And we could just read a couple of chapters to get a sense of exactly what Mark Twain was doing, because the fact is, I mean, I know there are people in the world that either they've read the book or maybe they haven't read the book. They're still going to come away with the conclusion that, it's racist because it has racist language, for example. Or Jim, right, the runaway slave Jim in the book is not some sort of hyper educated, magical Negro, right? Which is kind of weirdly enough, that seems to be some of the demands put upon the book, right? Why couldn't Jim be, more educated than the white people around him? Very silly stuff. But anyway, so for those of you who did not tune into the stream a few days ago, I was talking about young adult literature. I was basically asking the question, is this really, this whole industry, is this really made for kids in the spirit that it's normally said to be, right? And the reason why I had this question is I read on stream this essay from a few years ago by Kat Rosenfield, who is a young adult literature author, where she was just going through the very kind of toxic culture on young adult literature Twitter, right? YA Twitter. And, a lot of that stuff that we kind of associated with cancellations and whatnot over the past year with 2020 or whatever, that's been going on for a long time. And I think given the level of really adult-like toxicity on these platforms, you really should wonder whether or not these subcultures are what they claim to be, because the way that I view, just a quick recap for those that didn't watch the stream, the way that I view young adult literature is it's just like a capital intensive subculture, not unlike any others, right? We have all sorts of kind of, wasteful products that are put on the market. There's no reason to assume that books necessarily have to be any different, right? Simply because, hey, it's a book and therefore it's sacred, right? That's not really the case. I view young adult literature for the most part as just like America has found new markets to dump its goods to, just to continue expanding, growing and growing. People discovered a long time ago that, hey, there are, things called children, right? And these people, right, well, we call them things because that's the way they're sort of being seen. If we could get them reading these books, or if we get a bunch of libraries to order these books, or a bunch of schools to order these books, we have this whole marketplace, right, for young kids that could read our garbage, right? And we could sell it to them. And we could turn them into mini consumers before they're adults. And we could sort of get schools on board, we could get libraries on board, we could get institutions on board. And the way that we're going to get them on board to read our bullshit, which is why I sort of have this motivation here, is we sort of try to reject all the other things that we call bullshit around, right? So if we say, for example, that Mark Twain is a racist writer, all they were saying is, don't read that garbage that tells you nothing about racism. Read my garbage, right? Because I'm going to tell you everything that you need to know about racism. So, and, some companies, they might say, well, we're not really making too much money off of Mark Twain anymore compared to what we might make from this kind of, speculating on, for example, the next potential, Harry Potter or whatever, right? So we're just going to go with it, right? So, it's a business not unlike any other. The mere fact that we have kids involved, kids can just be used as meat shields, right? So, as I'm saying here, the intrinsic value of these books that are sold, that never seems to be very much a question, right? Other than in situations where we're going to criticize a book to replace it with something that I'm pushing, right? Or maybe if you're not pushing a book, maybe you're just one of these educators. Maybe you have a new education system that you want to propose. Maybe you want to be, a PhD researcher, right? And push new theories on classroom teachers or whatever. So what I'm saying is, let's just examine, the underpinnings of these industries, right? Because you can't assume that companies in general are simply there to help you, right? They're there to make money, and if things get in the way, such as children, right, we're just going to run them over. So Yeah, so yeah, just to continue this list, instead of genuine value, right? We're talking about the leveraging of emotions, self-interest, a casino-like atmosphere where everyone wants to write a bestseller, or maybe come up with a new educational theory, or maybe something in between, or perhaps they're just kind of careerist climbers, right? Maybe they just want to get a little bit ahead in their school or whatever it might be, right? So they sort of develop a following on Twitter, and they jump on all the latest fads. And when it comes to like sort of understanding how all of this gets kept in line, on the one hand, yes, we have the kids that are essentially meat shields for adults that are engaging in all sorts of disgusting careerism. On the other hand, intellectually speaking, right, there's a few tools to this trade. And one thing that I've noticed that's done a lot, right, is what I have here. The voice and the meta voice of a narrative, they're just oftentimes conflated. So you could have a racist character saying racist things, to use like a kind of generic example. But that's different from whether or not the author is taking a racist position, right? It's different from whether or not the author positions himself elsewhere, in the book's text, right? And whether or not this book, therefore, itself is positioned in a way that's a little bit different than what is being said about it publicly. So, so this conflation is done all the time. Same thing with like, you see this in lesser examples of like, white people, even when they are just quoting something, let's say they're quoting a book or anything, right? Or maybe they're quoting a racist person. Hey, this person said blah, blah, blah. Maybe they have a specific reason for having to say the N-word, right? And in the stream, since we're going to talk about Huck Finn and we're going to actually read it, right? I'm not going to censor that. We're just going to say it. So white people feel like they can't say it. Black people, I remember actually, although I'm not a big fan of Glenn Lowry or John McWhorter, one time McWhorter was doing a video and he said something like, when I'm on these panels and I'm talking about literature or I want to quote somebody, first of all, he himself said on the stream, well, it wasn't a stream, it was a video, he said N-word, literally, like, the euphemism. And he said he's not comfortable saying it publicly because he thinks people could dogpile on him, even if he's just quoting somebody. So we have a lot of that going on, right? We have the language codes as well as like willful misinterpretations of, voice versus meta voice, right? What is the difference between a character saying something versus the position throughout the book that an author is taking, right? And of course, we have that, unnecessary focus on the personal behavior, the beliefs, or, the identity of the author. I mentioned in the stream earlier in the week that when Jessica Schneider did her book on the black characters, during the Great Depression in America, like agents wanted to see like her photo. They wanted to see whether or not she was a white suburban lady or whether she was like, black. So, we're just getting a ton of that. So the reason why I want to talk about The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn today is this was one of the books that over the past month or so, we had this kind of like, call out culture kind of, reaching a high point on young adult Twitter. And Huck Finn was one of the books that was just routinely called out as a racist book, as a book that shouldn't be read in schools, as a book that says nothing, right, when it comes to the modern condition, and in fact is counterproductive when it comes to dealing with racism in the modern world. And to anybody that has ever read Huck Finn and has ever thought about it, I mean, I read this book as a kid. I read it several more times later as an adult. It's very clearly an anti-racist novel. In fact, Mark Twain was very much kind of like a moral writer, right? He's one of these people that, although he was exceptionally good at this and definitely the best of his generation and the best kind of moral writer, maybe up until that point in human history, actually, he clearly was against slavery, right? The characters and their interactions, and how the slave Jim gets absolutely humanized at the expense of many people surrounding him, even at the expense of the protagonist, right, who was Huckleberry Finn. The fact that it gets called out as racist, not only is it, damaging in terms of, well, suddenly kids have a book that they no longer can read, right? They're discouraged from reading it, that actually has something of value to say about the modern condition. That's in the first place. And the second place is, obviously this is going to bleed over to situations where, we're not even talking about, moral text, right? We're not talking about, guides for living. We're just talking about art in general. And of course, especially if you don't have, a cookie cutter lesson, it's much easier, right, to get canceled, as it were, in that situation. So all the implications are bad for kids. It's bad for writing. It's bad for art across the board. So you have to be able to push back against this in ways that make sense, and you have to do it in a way that actually collects evidence, right? So just to contextualize this, if you in fact are one of the people that has not read the book, maybe you're just tuning in and you're just kind of curious about the title, or maybe you want to see what the controversy is about. So to set it right, Huckleberry Finn is a 13-year-old, maybe 14-year-old kid. He comes into in the previous book, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, they come into a bunch of money in pre-Civil War South. It's a fictionalized city in in the Mississippi. They come into some money, and Huck Finn, he's very resistant, right? When it comes to education, he's resistant when his kind of legal guardian, I guess, she tries to civilize him, and he's always trying to escape that. But he actually has a perfect excuse when the book opens to, in fact, escape and go in the lamb as he does. Because his father, who's an alcoholic and abusive, he comes back. He tries to take his money. He I think gets hit actually in their interactions. And he's like, you know what? Fuck this. I don't want anything to do with this. I'm just going to escape. At the same time, Jim, who is a slave that that Huck Finn knows about, he overhears that his owner wants to sell him perhaps to a more violent or just all around worse slave owner of some sort. And he also has a family, right? He wants to take his family out of slavery too. So he escapes, Huck escapes, and they both sort of meet along the way, right? And Huck initially he's very he's very uncomfortable with what's happening, right? Because he's like, all right, so I escaped, and I'm not technically doing anything evil there, but Jim is a slave, right? And Jim is owned by someone, and Jim is supposed to belong to someone, and I'm actually participating in a crime if I'm escaping with him, or if I in some way am helping him escape. But those thoughts, right, which you would absolutely expect, right, from a white kid, 13, 14 years old, before the Civil War, these are thoughts that you would expect, even if, he's a good kid, right? I mean, he grows up thinking about this. He grows up feeling that there's a right way and a wrong way to do things. Everybody's telling you that slavery is okay, which is why when either Democrats or Republicans today, when they say this kind of a complete asinine virtue signaling bullshit, if I were in the 1800s, no way would I ever be a slave owner. The fact is, you have no idea what you would do, and probably most people, if you take them from today and you make them grow up in the 1800s and you give them the opportunity, right, the wealth, right, to own a slave, they probably would, right? That probably goes for most people. So none of this is unexpected, right? And it's only when you start becoming an adult and you start having adult thoughts and start making adult choices when I think you become totally culpable, right? I think that's the most rational way to think about it, right? So the book ends with Huck and Tom Sawyer concocting this elaborate ruse to free Jim when he's in fact captured as a runaway slave. And this is done because Tom Sawyer, he likes to go on these adventures, so there's like always an easy way to free Jim, and Tom Sawyer notices this, and Huck Finn notices this, but they want the more elaborate ruse, simply to have some excitement in their lives, right? Because on some level, though they're kids and they're sort of like they want to feel like they're doing the right thing, right? On another level, beyond like doing the right thing, like they just want to have fun, right? Keep in mind that this is like the original, YA literature, right? This is originally the thing geared towards children, of course, probably towards pretty smart children, but still, right? Kids could read this. I read this as a kid, right? I understood these themes as a young teenager. And, the question that I want to ask finally when we're done with reading the couple of chapters is, where are the stereotypes? Because we keep hearing that, Jim is superstitious, right? Jim is not educated. Like, we're just kind of, making fun of him. The fact is, everybody in this book is made fun of. Huck is not that much more educated than Jim. I think Jim can't read at all from what I remember in the book. Huck can, but it's not clear to us that he has taken on any more knowledge. Maybe like a little bit more, because, to the extent that if you can read versus not, you're going to have probably more knowledge. To the extent that you're white, even a white kid, in this situation, you're probably going to have more knowledge than a black person, especially a slave. All that is true, but let's just keep in mind that everybody seems to be critiqued and pilloried in this book. When Huck is thinking things that we know are wrong, we feel that, and he feels that, and he comes to terms with that himself. So that's just a way to contextualize the book. Let's actually read the text, though, to see whether or not I'm just bullshitting you, or whether or not we have evidence in the text that supports my contention here that this is, in fact, an anti-racist book. And as I said before, I will actually be saying the N-word. This is the last time I'll be saying N-word as a euphemism. So if you're not comfortable hearing this stuff, maybe you shouldn't be watching this stream. And actually, if you are watching this stream, whether you are a subscriber or you're new, thank you for watching. Please hit like and subscribe. It's actually very, very helpful as I continue doing these things. So this is chapter 14. This is already when Huck escapes his dad. So he's on the run. He's already met up with Jim. He's on the run. And now you see them in these like sets and sets of like, fairly, I would say, rich interactions. Sometimes just purely dialogue and sometimes other things. So to put that into context, this is where we are in the book, right? They're paddling along a river. Chapter 14. By and by, when we got up, we turned over the truck the gang had stole off the wreck and found boots and blankets and clothes and all sorts of other things and a lot of books and a spyglass and 3 boxes of cigars. We hadn't ever been this rich before in neither of our lives. The cigars was prime. We laid off all the afternoon in the woods talking and me reading the books and having a general good time. I told Jim all about what happened inside the wreck and at the ferry boat, and I said these kinds of things was adventures. But he said he didn't want no more adventures. He said that when I went into Texas and he crawled back to get on the raft and found her gone, he nearly died. Because he judged it was all up with him anyway it could be fixed. For if he didn't get saved, he would get drowned. And if he did get saved, whoever saved him would send him back home so as to get the reward, and then Miss Watson would sell him south, sure. Well, he was right. He was most always right. He had an uncommon level head for a nigger. So let's just think about this paragraph for a second. So to, Huck Finn, most likely he probably will not get murdered by his dad, but he doesn't want to be around him, so he escapes. This to him is very much an adventure. He knows he could come back anytime that he wants, and he could have, probably, I don't know what the equivalent today is, but maybe hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of dollars split between him and Tom Sawyer. So to him, this is this is a means to get this extended childhood. He could do that, right? Nothing in a sense could hurt him. He is protected not only by his skin color, he's also protected by the fact that he has money, right? He has that cushion forevermore. So he's having adventures, but Jim, he cannot risk being seen at all. He cannot risk being captured. Right? He's actually a slave. This is not something that Huck at the beginning of the book, and not in this chapter anyway, truly understands yet. Right? So, just if you're an objective reader getting into this, you should know already here, right, that there's a disconnect between these two characters. One is in reality, as reality is in fact constituted for millions of Black Americans in the 1800s, and the other one is he's able to have a kind of perpetual childhood. I read considerable to Jim about kings and dukes and earls and such, and how gaudy they dressed and how much style they put on, and called each other your majesty and your grace and your lordship and so on, instead of Mr. And Jim's eyes bugged out and he was interested. He says, I didn't know there was so many of 'em. I hain't hear about none of 'em scazely, but all kill Solomon, unless you counts them kings that's in a pack of your cards. How much do a king get? Get, I says. Why, they get $1,000 a month if they want it. They can have just as much as they want. Everything belongs to them. Ain't that gay? And what do they got to do, Huck? They don't do nothing. Why, how you talk? They just sit around. No, is that so? Of course it is. They just sit around, except maybe when there's a war. Then they go to the war. But other times they just lazy around or go hawking. Just hawking and, shh, did you hear a noise? So just keep in mind that in this conversation already, right, Huck is kind of, humorously relating something that is kind of technically true. Like, these kings and most nobles. I mean, Mark Twain wrote frequently about the nobility, right? If you read A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, right? He's constantly making fun of royalty, right? That they don't actually do anything; they're worthless, right? He said that if you put a pair of tights on a cat, right, that you essentially get a nobleman. And Huck, though, is also just kind of naive, right? And he's going to show his naivete as the text goes on, right? It's obvious that Jim can't really know all that much other than the physical reality of what he has to know. But Huck, so far, doesn't seem to know a great deal, that much more than him. We skipped out and looked, but it weren't nothing but the flutter of a steamboat's wheel away down, coming around to the point. So we come back. Yes, says I, and other times when things is dull, they fuss with the parliament, and if everybody don't go just so he whacks their heads off. But mostly they hang around the harem. Around the which harem? What's the harem? The place where he keeps his wives. Don't you know about the harem? Solomon had one. He had about 1 million wives. Why, yes, that's so. I done forgot it. A harem is a boarding house, I reckon. Most likely they has rackety times in a nursery. And I reckon the wives' quarrels considerable, and that creased the racket. Yet they say Solomon the wisest man that ever lived. I don't take no stock in that, because why? Would a wise man want to live in the midst of such blaming all the time? No, indeed he wouldn't. A wise man would take build a biler factory. I never really know what he's referring. What is a biler factory? Biller factory? Biler factory? And then he could shut down the biler factory when he wants to rest. Well, but he was the wisest man anyway, because the widow, she told me so, her own self. I don't care what the widow say. He weren't no wise man nother. He had some of their dad fetchedness ways I ever see. Does you know about the child that he was gwine up chopping too? Yes, the widow told me all about it. Well then, weren't dad the beaten's notion in the world? You just take and look at it a minute. That's the stump, Dad. That's the one there woman. Here's you. That's the other one, I Solomon, and this year dollar's bill the child, right? So he's holding up a dollar bill and he's trying to illustrate this. Before you can claims it, what does I do? Does I shine around amongst the neighbors and find out which on you the bill do belong to and hand it over to the right one, all safe and sound, the way that anybody that had any gumption would? No, I take and whack the bill in two and give half it onto you and the other half to the other woman. That's the way Solomon was going to do with that child. Now I want to ask you, what's the use of that half a bill? Can't buy nothing with it. And what's the use of half a child? I wouldn't give a darn for 1 million of them. So if you don't know the story, right, Solomon, to show like the wisdom of Solomon, right? One of the classical stories is Solomon is presented with two women who are in disagreement about who birthed a child. And, they're both claiming to have birthed this child. And Solomon says, I know, I'm going to tell these two, would-be mothers that I'm going to take this child, I'm going to cut it with a sword in half. And the mother that is truly the mother, right, she's going to say, no, don't do it, whatever, let the other, woman have it. And the one that's okay with this arrangement, right, who has no kind of, motherly feeling towards this child, she's going to say, okay, fine, great, wonderful. So obviously, like, what Huck Finn says here is correct. He says, but hang it, Jim, you've clean missed the point. Blame it, you've missed it 1,000 miles. So, on some level, I guess, to me, like, it was always a kind of strange story. But on some level, you could say that Jim, not having this kind of, education or not knowing, like, the point of the story, he does miss the point. But again, so far we don't see Huck Finn sort of getting the wider points about things in general, right? So we can't, if we're going to hold it against one, we're going to have to equally hold it against a white person too, right? So any claims of racism do kind of start to die with that. So after Huck Finn complains that he doesn't get it, Jim says, who, me? Go long. Don't talk to me about your pints. I reckon I knows sense when I see it. And dey's no sense in such doing as that. The dispute weren't about half a child. The dispute was about a whole child. And the man that think he can settle a dispute about a whole child with half a child don't know enough to come out in the rain. Don't talk to me about Solomon, Huck. I knows him by the back. But I tell you, you don't get the point. Blame the point. I reckon I knows what I knows. And mind you, the real point is down further. It's down deeper. It lays in the way Solomon was raised. You take a man that's got only 1 or 2 children. Is that man going to be wasteful of children? No, he ain't. He can't afford it. He know how to value them. But you take a man that's got about 5 million children running around the house, and it's different. He as soon chop a child in two as a cat. They's plenty more. A child or two, more or less, weren't no consequence to Solomon that fetch him, right? Which, by the way, like, so in terms of like Jim's understanding of the world, he himself, we know, has kids, right? He has a family that he wants to eventually buy out of slavery. And he knows for a fact that, hey, like, I know what it's like to raise children. Huck does not. I know that if I had too many kids, it is hard to care for all of them, right? Which is why people like Mia Farrow, right, get so much fucking criticism for just grabbing like 12 random kids from, some poor, countries or whatever, right? Knowing that she can't actually take care of them. And she, in fact, could not ever actually take care of them. So clearly, like, he is continually, like, so far, like, he does seem to be imparting some wisdom, right? And Huck might not be getting all the things that he thinks that he's getting. And Huck says, like, hearing, him talking about Solomon in such a way, he says to himself, I never see such a nigger. If he got a notion in his head once, there weren't no getting it out again. He was the most down on Solomon of any nigger I ever see. So I went to talking about other kings and let Solomon slide. I told him about Louis XVI that got his head cut off in France long time ago, and about his little boy the Dolphin that would have been a king, but they took and shut him up in jail, and some say he died there. So now we're getting closer and closer to like the limits of Huck's knowledge, right? So Louis XVI did have 2 sons, and they died, I think, well before even Louis XVI was executed. And his child that did remain went off to Austria, and that was a woman, right? That was a girl. And she went out and she lived out her adult life, I believe, in Austria. So already, again, if you're going to criticize Jim for being superstitious or not getting the point about, the Solomon story, let's be serious about the extent to which, not just like Huck Finn, but honestly, if you take any random adult, even like, the age of Jim, any white adult, from the South, they probably don't know that much more than Huck Finn. And probably Huck Finn knows even more than they do. All right. So let's remember that, right? Yes, we have, superstition, or we have like, notions in his head that weren't getting it out again. And also, like, just think about this criticism of black people, right? This is a very kind of common thing that you see, like, into even the 1900s. If he got a notion in his head once, there weren't no getting it out again, right? He's like the stereotypical sort of, white person in some senses, like tisking at a black person. But again, if you are a smart reader, right, you sort of know that this is what's going on, right? These two characters are both, sort of butting against the limits of their own knowledge. So hearing this story about the little boy, Jim says, "Po little chap. But some says he got out and got away and come to America." So he's like, confusing it with the girl. That's good. All right. He's also confusing Austria for America. That's good. But he'll be pooty lonesome. They ain't no kings here, is they, Huck? No. Then he can't get no situation. What he going to do? Well, I don't know. Some of them gets on the police and some of them learns people how to talk French. Why, Huck? Don't the French people talk the same way we does? No, Jim. You couldn't understand a word they said. Not a single word. Well, now, I'd be ding busted. How did that come? I don't know, but it's so. I got some of their jabber out of a book. Suppose a man was to come to you and say, "Parlez-vous français?" What would you think? I wouldn't think nothing. I'd take it and bust him over the head. That is, if he weren't white. I wouldn't, no nigger call me that, right? So, like, we're already getting, like, literally structural racism here, right? I would bust him over the head if he's white. I can't do it if he's black, right? Because we know there are consequences for that. Shucks, it ain't calling you anything. It's only saying, do you know how to talk French? Well, then why couldn't he say it? Why, he is a saying it. That's a Frenchman's way of saying it. Well, it's a blame ridiculous way, and I don't want to hear no more about it. There ain't no sense in it. Looky here, Jim. Does a cat talk like we do? No, a cat don't. Well, does a cow? No, a cow don't nuther. Does a cat talk like a cow or a cow talk like a cat? No, they don't. It's natural and right for them to talk different from each other, ain't it? Of course. And ain't it natural and right for a cat and a cow to talk different from us? Why, most surely it is. Well then, why ain't it natural and right for a Frenchman to talk different from us? You answer me that. Is a cat a man, Huck? No. Well then, there ain't no sense in a cat talking like a man. Is a cow a man? Or is a cow a cat? No, she ain't neither of them. Well then, she ain't got no business to talk like either one of the other of them. Is a Frenchman a man? Yes. Well then, Dad blame it, why don't he talk like a man? You answer me that. I see we're no use wasting words. You can't learn a nigger to argue, so I quit. So obviously, like, Jim doesn't seem to get that, there are languages other than English, right? And they sound, one way or another way. But on another level, like, what is Huck missing here, right? He thinks, right, okay, remember, this is the 1800s. Think of what people, understood things scientifically, right? Think of what they, how they would classify organisms, right? What is it? Is this like Linnaeus? I think so. But whatever, like whatever, categorization that you have, it was very common at the time, right, to view people of different races, especially black and white, as like, different species. Like, it's questionable to what degree actual, biologists or whatever believe that. Maybe even most of them didn't, but it was very common, like in the kind of wider culture, for people to hold that belief. And to a lesser extent, although like at that point we've expanded much of the circle of empathy to other white people, although not completely. Obviously, white immigrants coming in from Russia, coming in from Germany, like they weren't treated right in the same way that native-born white Americans were. But the way that white people would view black people is very much like this is a different species. So to him, it's very natural, right? To Huck, it's very natural to say that let's compare, an American and a Frenchman to the disconnect between an American and a cow, right? Or an American and a cat, or a cat and a cow. But to Jim, who himself sees himself as a human being, right? And wants to like emphasize that fact and that point about himself. By doing that, he cannot assume that other people are not people, right? He has to say, there's a man, a Frenchman, right? A Frenchman is a man. He's a man like I am a man, right? Why can't he talk like a man? And to him, talking like a man means speaking English. It doesn't matter that that's wrong, right? The deeper point is he cannot view, right, these other people as a different species, as somehow deserving of something other than, the same person that he wants for himself, right? Huck, he, on the one hand, he's a kid and he's also kind of ignorant, right? He doesn't get that, right? A white ignorant kid that he might have like, his heart in the right place, but he doesn't get that. So he says, I say to we're no use wasting words. You can't learn a nigger to argue, so quit. The irony, of course, is that he himself, right, hasn't truly learned to argue. He himself can't just willy-nilly, make that kind of claim, right? Knowing that or not knowing that this applies to him just as well, right? So this is kind of the, if you think about what is the point of this chapter, right? What is the point of this set of interactions? Yes, we're getting funny stuff, right? This is what the complainants say is true. A lot of this is treated in comic fashion, but it's not, this like superficial reading where, everything is exactly what it stands for. It's not that Jim is not worth learning or teaching rather how to argue, right? It's that neither of them think exactly, right? Like they're subject to the same follies, right, as the other. Like Jim, right? Think about how Jim like feels like very kind of like, his ego is kind of hurt, right? He's like, well, yes, that's so. I done forgot it, right? About Solomon's million wives, right? He doesn't want to admit like what he doesn't know. I mean, you must feel like sad about that. Like if you're a runaway slave and you can't read and the amount of knowledge that you're allowed to get by society is limited, you're gonna feel bad, right? Because if somebody calls you stupid or uneducated, it's difficult to have a set of defenses for that, right? You can't point to, well, actually you're wrong because blah blah blah. So he, like many people who maybe aren't like, educated, like they come to a point, right? Either it's about Solomon or about something else or about a Frenchman, and they keep like hammering it, right? Because giving it up means they're sort of giving up perhaps like a little part of themselves that everybody has already, made fun of for so long, and he doesn't want to do that. And again, if you're in any way a mature, intelligent reader, like you're gonna pick up on this. You're gonna know how people behave, right? You come into this book with a sense of what human beings are like. So let me think. Let me just see if there's any questions, and if not, we're gonna move on to the next chapter. All right, so we got DL in the chat. Twain was also anti-imperialist. He was anti a lot of stuff. I mean, he was one of these people that was very much ahead of his time, right? Alex, do you think there's any place in society for offensive or straight up bigoted art? Well, so DL, maybe, and I've actually been hoping to do this. This is it's in the public domain. Maybe I can in a little bit. I've been meaning to do like a stream on Birth of a Nation, right? Famously racist film. It's a great film for many reasons, but it is a famously racist film. Griffith himself, this wasn't just like some sort of misinterpretation, right? He actually was explicitly himself racist. And when he was called out for this kind of movie, and it caused rioting when it was screened, white liberals, black people, like they all rioted seeing this shit. Instead of like walking it back, he did this Trumpian thing where he said, well, fuck you. If you're offended, I'm going to sort of kick it up a notch. And, he started doing like movies like in reaction to, the responses that he got. So, but, there's a place for that movie in society. I've actually thought about this question for myself. Like on some level, like if you're making, like, for example, a truly great character, it's very hard to make a truly great character that is just like a racist or a bigoted caricature, right? Because if you're a complex, greatly written character, you're going to have heft to you, right? You're going to have something to you. Even if you have tons of negative qualities, you're going to have some kind of heft. So, I'm thinking like of ways to sort of answer that. But, maybe some of you guys watching this could watch Birth of a Nation if you haven't seen it. And, when I do one of these streams, and like we could like also watch it, I guess, live, and I could do like a running commentary. Like who knows? I am, like some people know, like I've been sort of planning out a couple of books, one of them being a work of nonfiction criticism, right? That answers or tries to answer some of these kind of more complex questions that maybe Dan hasn't really touched upon, or you don't really see done in a way that makes sense. So this is something that's interesting to me, and I want to think more about this before I just come with an answer for you. Yeah, so I guess in general I would just say there's clearly a place, simply because I can think of great art that is bigoted, that does have these problems. But I would have to think about it more to really like find like a robust way to discussing it, right? In a way that doesn't excuse anything, and also in a way that doesn't do like typical like SJW like woke shit, right? And pretends like we shouldn't even engage with it, right? Because that's not appropriate. Elvis says, "Can't wait for Alex to get banned for endorsing racism." I'm honestly like, when I sit here and I think like, okay, so I'm gonna be like doing the stream and I will be saying the word nigger because I'm reading a fucking book. I am thinking like, somebody might take this down, somebody might flag it. My account might I do think about it. It's very possible, right? But we're just gonna try. Okay, so DL, Birth of a Nation was one of the things I was thinking about. Haven't seen it, but always hyped for its influence and supposed quality. Okay, so, I mean, take some time, watch it. He could, he also has films in response to that film, meaning he has films in response to the responses to that film. Maybe we could talk about it on stream. Maybe we could do it live, but I think these are worthwhile questions. Anyway, thank you for the questions. I'm going to do chapter 15 now. Let me just exit out. Okay, so chapter 15. And by the way, like I originally just wanted to do chapter 15 to like show like, hey, let's just read chapter 15 to prove to people, hey, like this clearly is not a racist book. And I was like, well, let me see what's directly behind chapter 15. And what do you know? Like chapter 14 is just as good of an example of everything that I'm saying, right? So let's just keep that in mind. Like just so random, right? 2 chapters back to back that show, right, a kind of like anti-racist argument. Chapter 15. We judged that 3 nights more would fetch us to Cairo, the bottom of Illinois, where the Ohio River comes in, and that was what we was after. We would sell the raft and get on the steamboat and go way up the Ohio amongst the free states, and then be out of trouble. Well, the second night a fog begun to come on, and we made for a towhead to tie to. So towhead is it's like a this isn't used anymore, this word, right? This refers to like a a bank of sand, like if you see like a river, and then sometimes you see like some fresh land coming up, clearly like it was weathered at some point, right? It used to be part of the river for whatever reason. So he's just looking for some land, right, to attach the raft to. For it wouldn't do to try to run in a fog. But when I paddled ahead in the canoe with the line to make fast, there weren't anything but little saplings to tie to. I passed the line around one of them right on the edge of the cut bank, but there was a stiff current, and the raft come booming down so lively she tore it out by the roots, and away she went. I see the fog closing down, and it made me so sick and scared I couldn't budge for most half a minute, it seemed to me. And then there weren't no raft in sight. You couldn't see 20 yards. I jumped into the canoe and run back to the stern and grabbed the paddle and set her back a stroke, but she didn't come. I was in such a hurry I hadn't untied her. I got up and tried to untie her, but I was so excited my hands shook so I couldn't hardly do anything with them. As soon as I got started, I took out after the raft, hot and heavy, right down the towelhead. That was all right as far as it went, but the towelhead weren't 60 yards long, and the minute I flew by the foot of it, I shot out into the solid white fog, and hadn't no more idea which way I was going than a dead man. Thinks I, it won't do to paddle. First I know I'll run into the bank or a towelhead or something. I got to set still and float, and yet it's mighty fidgety business to have to hold your hand still at such a time. I whooped and listened. Away down there somewheres I hears a small whoop, and up comes my spirits. I went tearing after it, listening sharp to hear it again. The next time it come, I see'd it weren't heading for it, but heading away to the right of it. And the next time I was heading away to the left of it, and not gaining on it much either, for I was flying around and this way and that and the other, but it was going straight ahead all the time. I did wish the fool would think to beat a tin pan and beat it all the time, but he never did. And it was the still places between the whoops that was making the trouble for me. Well, I fought along, and directly I hears the whoop behind me. I was tangled good now. That was somebody else's whoop, or else I was turned around. I throwed the paddle down. I heard the whoop again. It was behind me yet, but in a different place. It kept coming and kept changing its place, and I kept answering till by and by it was in front of me again. And I knowed the current had swung the canoe's head downstream, and I was all right if that was Jim and not some other raftsman hollering. I couldn't tell nothing about voices in a fog, for nothing don't look natural nor sound natural in a fog. The whooping went on, and in about a minute I come a booming down and a cut bank with smoky ghosts of big trees on it, and the current throwed me off to the left and shot by amongst a lot of snags that fairly roared. The current was tearing by them so swift. So far we don't get much commentary here, right, in terms of racism or whatever. But I just want people to stop and appreciate this fucking language. I mean, this is, ostensibly from the perspective of a 13 or 14-year-old boy who's not very educated. But this book is just full of so many nice turns of phrase that are so believable, right? This is the crazy part, coming from a 13 or 14-year-old, but just really stick in the head, right? The way that a lot of the, when you have the downriver scenes when Jim and Huck are on the raft, there's very much this kind of really nice rhythmic quality that you could, imagine with the bobbing of water, right? Then you have just you're made to imagine this whoop, right? I heard the whoop again. It was behind me yet, but in a different place. It kept coming, and it kept changing its place, and I kept answering till by and by it was in front of me again, and I know the current had swung the canoe's head downstream, and I was all right if that was Jim and not some other raftsman hollering, right? So you could just imagine, just not, being able to see anything, right? This is a very nice way of a kid, right, describing that, right, without having to get lost in sort of, hard to believe poetry. And then you have this, right? The whooping went on, and in about a minute, I come a booming down in a cut bank with smoky ghosts of big trees on it. Right, this isn't, maybe it's a little bit too poetic, right, for a 13 or 14-year-old kid, but generally speaking, it's still within the realm of believability, which is what you want, right? You don't want to nitpick to death these kinds of things, but you want to always be able to say Mark Twain is staying within the realm of believability, right? In another second or two, it was solid white again, and still again. I sat perfectly still then, listening to my heart thump, and I reckon I didn't draw a breath while it thumped 100. I just gave up then. I knowed what the matter was. That cut bank was an island, and Jim had gone down the other side of it. And weren't no towhead that you could float by in 10 minutes. It had the big timber of a regular island. It might be 5 or 6 miles long and more than half a mile wide. I kept quiet with my ears cocked, about 15 minutes, I reckon. I was floating along, of course, 4 or 5 miles an hour, but you don't ever think of that. No, you feel like you are laying dead still in the water. And if a little glimpse of a snag slips by you, don't think to yourself how fast you're going. But you catch your breath and think, my, how that snag's tearing along. If you think it ain't dismal and lonesome out in a fog that way by yourself in the night, you try it once, you'll see. Next, for about half an hour, I whoops now and then, At last I hears the answer a long ways off and tries to follow it, but I couldn't do it. And directly I judged that it got into a nest of towheads, for I had little dim glimpses of them on both sides of me. Sometimes just a narrow channel between, and some that I couldn't see I knowed was there because I'd hear the wash of the current against the old dead brush and the trash that hung over the banks. Well, I weren't long loosing the whoops and amongst the towheads, and I only tried to chase them a little while anyway, because it was worse than chasing a jack-o'-lantern. You never know the sound dodge around or so, and swap places so quick and so much. I had to claw away from the bank pretty lively 4 or 5 times to keep from knocking the islands out of the river, and so I judged the raft must be butting into the bank every now and then, or else it would get further ahead and clear out of hearing. It was floating a little faster than what I was. Well, I seemed to be in the open river again by and by, but I couldn't hear no sign of a whoop nowheres. I reckon Jim had fetched up on a snag maybe, and it was all up with him. I was good and tired, so I laid down in the canoe and I said I wouldn't bother no more. I didn't want to go to sleep, of course, but I was so sleepy I couldn't help it, so I thought I would take just one little cat nap. But I reckon it was more than a cat nap. For when I waked up, the stars was shining bright, the fog was all gone, and I was spinning down a big bend stern first. First, I didn't know where I was. I thought I was dreaming, and when things began to come back to me, they seemed to come up dim out of last week. And this like dreamy kind of quality, right? They go to sleep, and then this thing passes, right? Just think about technically what's happening, right? We have just the plot, right? We know what's happening physically, but spending this amount of time just kind of describing, the whoops and the fog and getting lost, right? That very much does put the reader into this mindset of there might be some kind of little transition, right? There might be some kind of realignment of some sort, right? Maybe some kind of perhaps psychological insight, right? We're sort of making things unfamiliar, right? Because by the end of the chapter, Huck experiences things that are very unfamiliar to him. And Jim perhaps even experiences things that are unfamiliar to him, right? And this is you getting put into that mindset, right? We're almost, in this dreamlike fog, right? And we're falling asleep in it. And what happens after the dream is over? All right, so it was a monstrous big river here, with the tallest and the thickest kind of timber on both banks, just a solid wall, as well as I could see by the stars. I looked away downstream and seen a black speck on the water. I took after it, but when I got to it, it weren't nothing but a couple of saw logs made fast together. Then I see another speck and chased that, then another, and this time I was right. It was the raft. When I got to it, Jim was sitting there with his head between his knees asleep, with his right arm hanging over the steering oar. The other oar was smashed off and the raft was littered up with leaves and branches and dirt. So she'd had a rough time. When I was reading this recently, I remember just having I had a very kind of emotionally tender reaction to this description, right? So obviously this is Mark Twain doing it, or Huck Finn is not able to quite conceptualize things in this way, right, himself, but you just see this thing that happened where Jim is trying to find Huck, right? And Huck is on a river, and Huck seems what if he's dead somewhere? What if he drowned? What if something else happened? All right, and you could just imagine, right, knowing how Jim was already characterized up until that point in the book. It's just very tender, right? When it got to it, Jim was sitting there with his head down between his knees, asleep, with his right arm hanging over the steering oar, right? He's doing exactly what you did, Huck, right? He fell asleep just like you did. He was just as tired as you were. But watch this description. The other oar was smashed off and the raft was littered up with leaves and branches and dirt. So she'd had a rough time. Huck, who is, he may have his heart in the right place, but he's still a white kid in the context of slavery. He doesn't really know anything yet. And his response immediately is, wow, look at that thing, right? This object, this raft, this thing, right? She had a rough time. And it's so wonderful and peculiar for Mark Twain to make the choice that, we're going to call the raft a she, right? We're going to give it personhood, right? We're going to turn it into a person. we're going to feel bad about the rough time that the raft had of it. But Huck Finn at no point here stops and thinks like, fuck, like Jim must be scared. He must feel sad. He must think like, what happened to Huck? Right? None of that enters his head. It could be because he's just like a, a dumb, piece of shit kid who's like selfish, like other kids or whatever. But I do think it's telling that Twain like makes this choice to make you, the educated reader, have this kind of tender response to Jim, and end it by giving everything your personhood in Huck's mouth, other than Jim himself, right? Like that is not nothing, right? That is not just some random bullshit, for you to dismiss, especially if you're trying to craft either this is a racist book narrative or this is an anti-racist book narrative. I made fast and lay down under Jim's nose on the raft and began to gap and stretch my fist out against Jim and says, "Hello, Jim, have I been asleep? Why didn't you stir me up?" Goodness gracious, is that you, Huck? And you ain't dead, you ain't drowned, you's back again? It's too good for true, honey, it's too good for true. Right? Like, as far as vernacular, it's very well phrased. Let me take a look at you, child. Let me feel you. No, you ain't dead. You's back again, live and sound. Just the same old Huck. The same old Huck, thanks to goodness. Right? So we, the reader, we had a very kind of humanizing response to seeing Jim asleep. Right? It's very tender. And now we see Jim being very tender. Right? He's being nurturing. He is seeing Huck as not just a child, but also just like he's a human being. Right? And he's recognizing as such. This is a person like I am. Right? As ridiculous as I find this idea of comparing human beings to cats or cows, right? I'm not going to let his skin color get in the way of recognizing who this is. I'm not even going to allow my oppression and knowing that this kid has the skin color of my oppressors. I'm not going to let that interfere with my understanding either of Huck's personhood and his value as a human being by virtue of being a human being. What's the matter with you, Jim? You been a-drinking? Right, so here, like immediately, right, like this kind of, just making fun of Jim, right, not caring about what he must have gone through. Drinking? Has I been a-drinking? Has I had a chance to be a-drinking? Well then, what makes you talk so wild? How does I talk wild? How? Why, ain't you been talking about my coming back and all that stuff as if I'd gone away? Huck Finn, you look me in the eye, Hain't you been gone away? Gone away? Why in the nation do you mean? I ain't been gone away anywheres. Where would I go to? Well, looky here, boss. They some wrong day is I me, or who is I? Is I here, or what is I? Now's that what I wants to know. Well, I think you're here, plain enough, but I think you're a tangle-headed old fool, Jim. I is I? Well, you answer me this. Didn't you tote out the line in the canoe for to make fast to the towhead? No, I didn't. What towhead? I ain't seen no towhead. You ain't seen no towhead? Looky here. Didn't the line pull loose and the raft go humming down the river and leave you in the canoe behind the fog? What fog? Why the fog that's been all around all night. And didn't you whoop and didn't I whoop till we got mixed up in the islands and one of us got lost and the other one was just as good as lost because he didn't know where he was? And didn't I bust up again a lot of them islands and have a terrible time and almost get drowned? Now ain't that so, boss? Ain't it so? You answer me that. Well, this is too many for me, Jim. I ain't seen no fog, nor no islands, nor no troubles, nor nothing. I've been sitting here talking with you all night till you went to sleep about 10 minutes ago. And I reckon I done the same. You couldn't got drunk in that time, so of course you've been dreaming. Dat fetch it. How is I going to dream all that in 10 minutes? Well, hang it all, you did dream it because there didn't any of it happen. But Huck, it's just as plain to me as it makes no difference how plain it is. There ain't nothing in it. I know because I've been here all the time. Jim didn't say nothing for about 5 minutes, but sat there studying over it. Then he says, well then, I reckon I did dream it, Huck. But dog my cats if it ain't the powerfulest dream I ever see. And I ain't ever seen no dreams before that's tired me out like this one. Oh well, that's all right because a dream does tire a body like everything sometimes. But this one was a staving dream. Tell me all about it, Jim. So Jim went to work and told me the whole thing right through, just as it happened, only he painted it up considerable. Then he said he must start and interpret it, because it was sent for a warning. He said the first towel had stood for a man that would try to do us some good, but the current was another man that would get us away from him. The whoops was warning that would come to us every now and then, and if we didn't try hard to make out to understand them, they just take us into bad luck instead of keeping us out of it. The lot of towelheads was troubles we was going to get into with quarrelsome people and all kinds of mean folks. But if we minded our business and didn't talk back and aggravate them, we would pull through and get out of the fog and into the big clear river, which was the Free States, and wouldn't have no more trouble. So I just want to think about this paragraph for a second. So Jim describes, right, the events of the chapter that we just read. He seems to have painted it up considerable, right? Again, just in terms of just a writerly perspective, right? Like very beautiful, right? Very beautiful stuff. But Jim gets criticized, right, by like modern day readers as, oh, clearly he's like, some sort of superstitious, like magical Negro. Right? He's that trope. And, on some level, to the extent that uneducated people are superstitious, like, which I'm sure Huck, like, is probably pretty, I don't remember all the details, right, of the various things that he does. But Huck, I'm sure in this book is plenty superstitious. I'm sure that other people in this book are plenty superstitious. But, we have a runaway slave here explicitly being presented in this way. But here's the interesting part. First of all, when it comes to these superstitions, I mean, I'm sure you could read the remainder of the book, very much in this light that there are going to be good and bad people, and there are going to be people that are trying to take them away, put them in, and it's up to them to sort of navigate through all that, right? That is, in fact, literally how the rest of the book goes. But think about the way that Jim is like framing all of this, right? Like, he said that he's going to get into with quarrelsome people and all kinds of mean folks. But if we minded our business and didn't talk back and aggravate them, we would pull through and get out of the fog and into the big clear river, right? This is exactly how a runaway slave is going to think. This is exactly how a non-runaway slave is going to think. This is how a non-slave black person anywhere in America, right, during this time period would think. They would think, listen, life is hard, and we have all these things like coming out, out of the future against us, right? That are all potential dangers, right? But if we mind our business, if we don't talk back, which is like clearly like this is like slave talk, right? This is when slaves were like infantilized, right? Like just don't talk back to your master, right? And don't aggravate me, right? And then I won't beat you. This is clearly a slave's thinking, right? And the slave's projection. And it might very well be 100% justified and rational for Jim to think that. Huck, again, 14-year-old boy, he can't understand, like he's treating all this as a joke, right? To him, this is still an adventure, right? So when he sees Jim like all kind of, busted up alongside the raft, he's not able to necessarily have the same tender moment that I had when I read like those two sentences, right? And Jim, right? He's sort of paraphrasing Jim, but Jim clearly gave his perspective as a runaway slave in this paragraph, right? And you could, and if you're one of these like dumbfuck readers, right? Ellen, what was her name? Ellen, oh hell no, these like worthless like don't buy that shit, buy my shit, right? This is all that it comes down to. Don't buy that shit, buy my shit, right? Huck Finn, if Huck Finn is like the premier anti-racist book, and we all say it as such, and this is, what's read in every classroom at some point, that's less reading that they could do of my bullshit, right? So there's tons of motivated reasoning for why this needs to be a racist book that we sort of, burn and take out of libraries. So after Huck paraphrases this, we get to the rest of the chapter. We're almost done, guys. It had clouded up pretty dark just after I got on the raft, but it was clearing up again now. "Oh, well, that's all interpreted well enough as far as it goes, Jim," I says. "But what does these things stand for?" It was the leaves and rubbish on the raft and the smashed oar. You could see them first rate now. Jim looked at the trash, then looked at me, then back at the trash again. He had got the dream fixed so strong in his head that he couldn't seem to shake it loose and get the facts back into its place again right away. Beautiful fucking sentence. You think Ellen, oh hell no, could write a fucking sentence like this if her bio says, I live in Bethesda now and I'm still on the quest for the perfect bagel outside of New York City. And that's how you know this is a person that clearly has never been to Montreal because, sorry, Montreal bagels are better than New York City bagels. I say this as a New York City partisan. Beautiful sentence, but again, right? Like, he doesn't understand why he can't seem to shake the dream loose and get the facts into his place right away. Jim has an understanding of all the dangers that are surrounding him, right? He has to. Right? Huck Finn, again, he could come back at any time. It's not going to matter. Jim has to have this thought. But when he did get the thing straightened around, he looked at me steady without ever smiling and says, all right, very serious, right? This is how an adult talks to a kid that's in trouble, right? Jim, although he's constantly sort of like, genuflecting, in front of this boy because, he's white, and he calls him things like boss, and clearly, there's like a paternalistic relationship between, Huck towards Jim, even though that, Jim being the actual adult, he knows that he's actually the one responsible for Huck, right? And he's doing everything within his power to preserve his life as well. So this is the moment where you have Jim emphasizing, insisting upon his humanity, right? He's saying, okay, all that bullshit that just happened, fuck it. I am the adult. You're the child. I'm not going to smile at you. You're in trouble. This is what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to insist upon my manhood and my adulthood, right? Because we're past where we were. And this is what Jim says, unsmilingly. What do they stand for? I was going to tell you. When I got all wore out with work and with the calling for you and went to sleep, my heart was most broke because you was lost, and I didn't care no more what become of me in that raft. And when I wake up and find you back again, all safe and sound, the tears come, and I could have got down on my knees and kissed your foot. I so thankful. And all you was thinking about was how you could make a fool of old Jim with a lie. That truck is trash, and trash is what people is that puts dirt on the head of their friends and makes them ashamed. And then he got up slow and walked to the wigwam and went in there without saying anything but that. But that was enough. It made me feel so mean I could have almost kissed his foot to get him to take it back. So think about this. He's such a white kid in pre-war South, right? That although he feels so ashamed about what just happened, it made me feel so mean I could almost kiss his foot, right? He's not gonna do that, right? He can't. He's still that white kid, right? He's still that 14-year-old, little shit stain, right? He's not like, he's not always the nicest kid, but he does have a good heart. But he can't bring himself, right, to do that, right? He can't even bring himself to write that image, to imagine that image. It was 15 minutes before I could work myself up to go and humble myself to a nigger. But I done it, and I weren't ever sorry for it afterwards neither. I didn't do him no more mean tricks, and I wouldn't done that one if I'd have knowed it would make him feel that way. So why didn't he know that it would make him feel that way? Because there is this disconnect between the two of them. He does not yet, well, maybe up until this point, truly see Jim as a human being like other human beings, right? Part of that is because he's a kid. Part of that is also because of race. I know, like when I was a kid, me and my brother, I was a fucking nightmare. Every nanny that I had, because it was a single mom, and my grandma was around, but like nobody spoke English, and sometimes people are like often out for work. I was like 7 or 8 years old. My mom wanted to have nannies, and I hated the idea of having nannies. I was like, fuck having a nanny. Why can't I, as an 8-year-old, just like watch over myself? I thought I could just be at home, like, playing video games or whatever, whatever it is that I wanted to do. I didn't want adult supervision because I'm a kid, right? Like that's kids want that kind of freedom, even if it's like bad and unhealthy for them. So I was a fucking terror to these nannies, right? I would be physically abusive, right? I had tons of like anger problems when I was a kid. I would play these kinds of mean tricks. So in some ways, it wasn't a racial thing. They were all, they spoke my language, right? They spoke Russian to me. Like I was playing mean tricks simply because I was a kid, right? It wasn't a disconnect in terms of race, and it wasn't even necessarily a disconnect in terms of like status, because I was also constantly like, in fear of like, am I going to like lose my house? Is that going to happen to me? So, but kids have that disconnect, but we know there's this additional disconnect in this text because of the race, right? And we know that this is not just the childish stuff coming out, right? He said he could almost kiss his foot, right? He can't do that because it's a black person. He says so clearly, right? He said explicitly, it was 15 minutes before I could work myself up to go and humble myself to a nigger, right? But this is where Jim emphasizes his humanity. This is where he says, like, we're essentially in this together. I'm looking out for you. You're looking out for me. This is what has to be kind of like forevermore, right? Even though I'm the adult, let's treat each other with respect, right? So this is such a wonderful fucking like set of images. Like if you're looking for an anti-racist narrative that you want to teach kids, this is a great book, right? If you're Ellen, oh hell no, and you're either too fucking dumb to understand what you're reading, or you're just so threatened by clearly a much superior writer than you could ever dream to be. I get it. But if you actually are interested in kids learning something, like you're telling me you can't do a fucking lesson. Like we've been here for like a little over an hour. Some classrooms run 75 minutes, 90 minutes. You're telling me you can't do a close reading to discuss all this and make students stop and ask them to like opine on various chapters or various paragraphs. You can't do that. Is this really too complicated? It's not too complicated. You could do it. It's okay. I get that you're threatened by the fact that this is a superior novel to your like shit that you write, but since I don't operate right under this rubric of a capital intensive subculture, I'm not interested in instruments being produced like for the hell of it, right? Like we have too much of it. We have too many books. We have too much garbage out there. Too many bad movies. Too much bad everything. Too many bad essays. I don't fucking read people's dumbass opinion pieces. I hate like opinion bylines because they're trash. I don't give a fuck about people's dumb opinions. I don't want these bad like capital intensive instruments to just come out there. Okay, if you're interested in actual books, actual art, you would see it, right? You would see it in that, right? If you don't feel threatened, right? You would see this in Huck Finn. Was there something else that I want to? Oh yeah. So just to finish this, right? I didn't answer this question, but it's a question that I do legitimately have. Like, is anyone else embarrassed that I'm doing this video? Because I feel like I never thought, like when I was younger, like, oh, I could write about books. Like, I never thought that I would ever. Well, I wouldn't ever write an essay about this because it's just too like. I write very slowly as it is. It takes me a long time. I'm constantly like editing stuff and like I'm very perfectionistic in that way. So it would take too much time. It would be too worthless for me to like prove to the world that this is not a racist novel. And here's all the evidence. I'm not going to spend like a week writing an essay to prove that. But I could stream for like 75 minutes, right, to prove that. So I never thought though that I would be in a position, like having read this book as a kid, having read it many times as an adult. I never thought I would be in the position to like have to tell as an adult to other adults, by the way. So if kids want to watch this, great. Sorry for the cursing. But if adults are watching this and I have to tell this to adults, I am kind of embarrassed. Like I don't think I should have to be doing this. I don't think anyone should have to be doing this. I think people that have degrees, right, that've been through college and ostensibly like the bare minimum we know that they've reached, which is like they know how to read, like literally, like even if it's just like superficially, I don't think I should have to like prove that, right? I don't think I should have to say that actually Huckleberry Finn is a classic anti-racist book, right? And Mark Twain personally, as well as in other books, has all the bona fides to prove that.